Hello, Millie. It's a pleasure to have you at Conversational with Iris. Millie Graham-Wood is solicitor at Privacy International, and the topic of today's conversation is about the use of digital borders and digital technologies to govern migrants and non-citizens in the UK.
Hi, thank you very much for having me. A topic I love talking about, but obviously very scary what we're seeing on the horizon.
So what do you see as the main issue that we need to pay attention to in relation to the use of digital technology in relation to migration?
There are sort of different intersecting issues for us is that, first of all, with the use of new technologies, there's a lack of understanding amongst, say, migrant organizations. And that's where we hope to help with our expertise, because if you can't understand what the technology is doing, you don't necessarily see all the risks. So, for example, a lot of technologies that are being brought in, it's not just the use of them, but the sort of data that's generated and an assumption that that is reliable. And that's not always the case. So if decisions are being made on the basis of data that's generated by things that you don't understand how it works, and no one knows to question that, then that's going to be hugely problematic. Anything that comes from a digital device or is generated via automated decision making or that kind of thing, it needs to be interrogated. Well, then you open up a whole different conversation, like who has those skills, who can afford to do that in the context of migration. So I guess that's the danger, is that we're not necessarily...
Are there ways, I mean, if we're thinking about all this use of technologies in relation to migration, is there a way of somehow categorize them or to think of them? I mean, what are the main sort of challenges or aspects in the life of immigrants where they may come across some of this use of these technologies?
Well, one of the ways that we've looked at it in a recent report on the different tech that's being used is, say, front end and back end technologies. So if you think about it, the back end is what you don't necessarily see. So the processing of data, the different databases that are used, the different databases that might work together. If you think about the Home Office's desire for data from all sorts of different government departments, all of that kind of thing going on in the background, how that's processed, what software is processing that. And then on the front end, I guess, is more visible things like mobile phone extraction, the taking of biometrics, the use of satellites and drones. The Aspen card is something we've talked about a bit as well. Facial recognition, I guess you could go into, use of CCTV, and all those more visible things that are easier to comprehend the risks that they may present than perhaps the back end stuff that's a bit more technical.
Yeah, I mean, in a few years ago, I was doing some research on access to maternity services for undocumented migrant women and the impact on their children. And one of the things that was coming out a lot was the extent to which people were fearing the connection between the maternity services and the Home Office, both in terms, people can get charged, but also the fact of being on record that use the services. So it's actually this idea of joining up databases with the NHS and the Home Office is something that has sort of a real life implication also, in spheres like maternities and access to school, for example, etc.
Exactly, and there's a sort of, over the last couple of years or longer, really, the police have been creating a new database called the Law Enforcement Database System or program, LEDS, and that's going to, if it comes in, it's going to create a huge change in terms of access to immigration data. And with all these things, you create or attempt to create this huge new database. And not only is it the data that's on there, it's who can access it, and that they are now able to access information that they previously weren't able to, either from a mobile device, say a stop on the street, or back in the office, and opening it up as well to, say, immigration officers, gives them access to data they never used to have before. And even though there may be access controls, the breadth of individual who can access it is huge and is very worrying in terms of the change that is happening at, say, at the back end.
It looks like one of the sort of the side effects of the COVID pandemic has been very much a period of experimentation with the potential of some of these technologies. They really about the mapping of the movements of people, checking where they are, or checking where they go, and all this sort of real-time kind of checks. And having worked with people with precarious legal status, this has also become a reason of concerns or of anxieties, because obviously then there is no reassurance that those information which are collected for public health reason are not used then by the Home Office for immigration control. What do we know in terms of reassurance about how these data are used? I mean, what is that is there a charter or?
I'm not sure. That's one of the problems is almost at the time that a lot of these projects are conceived, the impact on migrants is not necessarily given the in-depth thought that it should be. So we as privacy focused individuals, we often think about the impact assessments that should be done when these things are proposed, and they're really never done in much detail. So a privacy impact assessment, equality impact assessment, human rights impact assessment, and when we read them, the individuals completing them or government departments completing them don't seem to understand the different implications of a different impact assessment. And then one of the things that really isn't thought about a lot is the security of this information, whether it be between different government departments or from other state or non-state actors. Then it's not just how the Home Office is trying to take it and it's being shared, say, by the Department of Health or Department of Education. It's also how secure is that sharing from a government who will be interested in the movements of an individual in the UK or information about them. So I don't think the security of information in and of itself or from other government departments is necessarily given enough thought. In terms of government sharing, I don't think it's necessarily given much thought from the perspective of what impact does that have on the migrant in their own well-being if their information is being shared between different government departments, and the fear that has on an individual, like how it impacts on their ability to integrate within society if they have this constant fear that everything they're doing is being monitored and shared and decisions are being made about them based on it.
I was thinking, when you were mentioning the technologies like facial recognition, for example, so these are more like the front end one in your typology. Are there risks with those specific risks for this kind of technologies more linked to the front end?
There are all sorts of risks. I mean, there are ones that in terms of how we feel as a society with them, but also particularly them being used against migrants in terms of experimenting with different technology, when there's, I guess, in terms of what the government will presume, there's less likely to be resistance if it's used on the migrant population to being used on the general population. So a perfect testing ground for technologies that they're not really sure whether they would be acceptable or whether they want to see how they work. And that can be, I mean, we've seen facial recognition used more broadly, to be honest, in the population. I think in new plans in relation to border controls, we'll see it used more and more. The concern with that is the pervasiveness of it, and how it will be used, whether it will be used against lists of individuals or whether it will be then used to track people. That's the trouble with something like facial recognition. There's so many different permutations of it. You need the detail of how they intend to use it to then be able to see the problems that arise from it. Other things we see is social media monitoring. So in fact, in the US, I think I'm not sure whether it's still the case, you're asked to share your social media handle. And then there was a lot of stuff about how searches would be conducted on you, and that would be stored in your immigration files and used in decision making. So this is just a whole different level of surveillance of an individual and how their activities online, whether that's via Instagram or Reddit or Facebook, and if you don't know how to keep your profiles protected, then decisions are being made on things you might just say without thinking online. And then there's other things to do with device extraction, so taking data from mobile phones, which we're seeing in the new police crime sentencing and courts bill. And then as was publicized today, the new GPS tracking on migration bail. So which that already exists within criminal bail, but it's much more constrained in how it's used, whereas it seems for migrants it's more of a free-for-all. And there's a worrying aspect where it can be used to make decisions on their cases.
I don't know if this is an area where you've done more specifically, but are there risks related to racial profiling linked to the use of these technologies? Because I know that in the US there's been research on the algorithm, etc.
I think arguments to be made around how the technology is created, in a sense of who's programming it, who's writing the software, and what's their, you know, either conscious or unconscious bias in doing it, what training data set are they using, and the implications that then has if you're thinking about automated decision making for the decisions that are made, which have huge impact on individuals' lives. Because it's also easy to blame the technology, but then you have to look, well, who created that? What was the reasoning behind it? And that's why you need to be able to sort of look into the black box and understand what's going on in there. And that's a big argument. It's like, how is this algorithm working and why is it making this decision? But then you go back to the basic point of an individual who's been, say, refused asylum or had a negative decision. How are they even meant to start doing that if they don't have legal representation, if they don't have any money? It's sort of one thing in theory, another in practice.
Sure. I mean, similar to what to some of the debate, for example, on the use of drone for military purposes. Now, this idea of the accountability. You know, in case of a machine error or a technology error, what are the currently? I mean, the way to have recourse or to make them mistakes accountable or monitoring or appealing? Is there are they system in place?
I think the legal system is probably slowly playing catch up, and certainly the legislation is not necessarily there in many places in relation to technology. I guess a lot of laws could still be used if you were seeking to challenge an error, but it's kind of hard without examples to sort of think it through. But yeah, I think there's a vacuum that in probably the sort of case law in this area and the legislation to deal with errors, and whether there's a willingness to even address that in current or future governments.
Just maybe to conclude, going back to a point you made at the very beginning, it was about the fact that migrant community or support groups, they may sort of still have not really understand how those technologies work. And I was wondering, you know, what can be done? I mean, if you think in terms of like what needs to be changed, how we can ensure that there is, and going back also to the point about accountability, how, you know, that's we can respond to these changes from the perspective of the advocates and supporters of migrants.
Well, I'm sure a lot of people do have a good awareness, understanding, but if there are organizations that don't, that's what Privacy International is here, and that's what we want to help and work with organizations on, is to increase the understanding of the use of technology, its technologies themselves and the ones that are deployed, so that migrant organizations themselves can look out for what needs to be challenged to ensure that they're able to protect the individuals and support the individuals that they see that we don't you know, have day-to-day interaction with. For example, on the GPS tracking or mobile phone extraction used by immigration officers, you know, we're happy to sit there and go through the technical aspects of it and explain and see if when decisions are then made, lawyers who are representing these individuals or the migrant organizations know what to look out for, because it takes all of us working together to try and support these individuals and organizations, to make sure that the technology used or the decision making that results from it is accountable, and there's a level of transparency too, because so much is changing all the time.
Just final point, from your experience, are there groups of migrants that are more vulnerable to these changes, or they seem to be, from your experience or the cases you have encountered?
I'd say when it involves the use of certain decision making or different technologies, then whether you're someone who is treated favorably by the government or not, it may affect you anyway, because it will be imposed to make certain decisions, and who knows what the impact of it will be.
They're quite democratically in there being dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, certainly it has implications for society. If we think more broadly, if this was used against us, how would we feel? And rather than just thinking it's used against certain communities that people may or may not want to support, if you want to put it that way.
And also the fact that they're using the migrants as a sort of guinea pigs is actually an important aspect. So, in a sense, to bear in mind, this sense of why people should also pay attention to these things happening,
yes.
Not just for a kind of altruistic reason, but also more selfishly.
Maybe, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot for your time, and then I'll edit a bit. But it's been great to have you here on a conversation with Iris, and I think you open a very important and interesting areas that I think not many people in migration studies pay enough attention to at the moment.